All right, so I've gone over some of your, all of your fourth week papers and marked them and returned them to you. And there were a number of issues that came up in the papers that I'd like to cover. As pretty commonly throughout this course, what I'm really giving you, or oftentimes what I'm giving you in these videos, is information basically, or background on the evolutionary process, because that really is the heart of, where did all these species come from? How did we get the Anthropoidea and the Persimmon? And how did we get the evolution of Homo? All of that is essentially an evolutionary study. So I'm trying to give you the background, the evolutionary background to the fossil material and the sort of explanatory engine for all of these material things that we see that result from that process. So a couple of things. The number of species, it really depends on which anatomist or primatologist you ask how many species of primates or Persimmon or whatever there are. And to tell you the truth, the number is fluid. It's changing. For example, just a couple of years ago, I think a new species of lemur was discovered. So, okay, that changes that. And occasionally with new genetic studies, for example, we decide that two species or two animals, two populations that we used to call separate species actually belong within perhaps just one species. So that number is fluid. We don't know everything. Science doesn't know everything. We're continually learning, and it's an incremental thing. So the number of species, I don't get hung up with precisely how many there are. That's almost irrelevant. There are a couple of hundred. You can get further into the details later if you become a primatologist. But for our level, for a 100-level class, the idea that there are about 200 species of primate is sufficient. But it is a fluid number, and we needn't get fixed on precisely how many there are, because that number changes as our knowledge changes. Many of you mentioned the characteristics of different species. I asked you to make some notes or tell me something interesting about one of the species that you've looked at. And so you might have said that the tail is particularly useful or prehensile in some New World species. Or some of the Madagascar lemurs, the eye, for example, has this unusual characteristic, this trait of the long finger used to excavate into the bark and get at insects and so on. When you look at a species, remember I mentioned this in the last video comments, but when you look at the characteristics of a species, keep in mind you can look at one characteristic, the length of the nose, the width of the nostrils, whatever it is. You can look at that characteristic and start to think, what is its evolutionary advantage? But we have to be very careful with that. Two ways that you can get stuck or get off track there. One is that you remember that there was an evolutionary history to a species, a bow plan, that sort of constructs it or sort of constrains the kinds of variation or constrains the amount of variation that can come up. So you might have a characteristic that might in previous forms of that species have been very useful, adaptive, but perhaps now is a vestigial character and that's not necessarily selectively advantageous. We have, for example, the appendix it used to be part of the large intestine. It's no longer, though, useful in an evolutionary sense. It's a vestige. It doesn't cost us too much in caloric terms, so it hasn't entirely gone away. The other way that you can get trapped or go wrong with thinking about species characteristics is that when you look at an organism, the characteristics are not separated from one another, and what you have actually are what are called functional complexes, such that if you consider the foot of a human being, well, that is, you can look at the characteristics of the foot, but actually it's part of the larger, what we call locomotor skeleton of the whole body. The entire anatomy, well, I shouldn't say the entire, but the great part of the anatomy, the spine, the pelvis, the legs, a large part of our anatomy changed as a result of a shift towards bipedalism that you're starting to learn about now with regard to the hominids. So what you've got is a functional complex, and you have to keep in mind that any characteristic, any trait of a species might be involved in a larger, or probably is involved in a larger complex, and so drawing the lines very specifically around what is the evolutionary advantage, again, of that specific characteristic, that could get pretty complicated and hooked together with lots of other variables. Another way to go wrong on that is what we call a spandrel. This is the phenomenon by which a characteristic might turn out to be simply the consequence of other characteristics. An example from this is taken from architecture, and there's a paper from the 70s called The Spandrels of San Marco by Stephen Gould, and a prominent evolutionist, and he was pointing out, with his co-author, he was pointing out that these arches, the beautiful arches that you see in the cathedral architecture of sort of medieval Europe, those beautiful arches, yes, they look really beautiful, and they're even, you see a column of stone, it goes up and it spreads out, and they have started to paint and decorate the spaces between these branching structures, right? These stony branching structures that are used to support the cathedral. And so art historians went through and said, wow, look, they've invented this whole new art form, or this whole new space, which is the triangular sort of space between these buttresses that fly out. And that is a spandrel, and here's the whole world of spandrel art. Functionally, though, what's going on is that spandrel, that triangular area, is simply a consequence, it has to be there, simply a consequence of the fact that you need to have that weight channeling down into the column to support the structure. You see what I mean? The spandrel then is not a functional thing that was designed to be a spandrel, but it has to be there based on the other characteristics of the architecture. You can think about the same sort of thing in functional terms in the biology, the structures of a living system. So there are a number of reasons that looking at the characteristic of a species might, or where you might go wrong in trying to identify, well, what was this characteristic for? Somebody mentioned two last things. Somebody mentioned the fact that, yes, we have these eyes towards the front of the head in the primates, and that you also see that in a lot of predators. And this, in fact, goes back to one of the hypotheses early on for early primate evolution is what's called the visual predation hypothesis, and this is the idea that early primates, 60-odd million years ago, early primates were actually, they're arboreal, living in the trees, as you know, and that they were visual predators. And predators do typically have pretty good vision and stereoscopic vision. So the visual predation hypothesis, you can look it up, is proposed by Matt Cartmill back in the 70s or 80s, and it's still around as a pretty viable explanation for forward positioning and stereoscopic and really good vision in early primates. It's also been pointed out, though, that being an arboreal creature and jumping from limb to limb and climbing through this complex environment, there would also have been a selective advantage for creatures born with their eyes slightly further forward and towards the front and giving a little bit better stereoscopic vision. So there may be more than one reason for that.